Welcome to Sweet Talk. This broadcast is brought to you by the Continuing Education Workforce Training Division of Idaho State University's College of Technology. This podcast is part of our continuing outreach efforts, and the format is conversational. We will be having conversations with businesses, professionals, entrepreneurs, community agencies, and, in all cases, difference makers. Now, let's get started with Sweet Talk.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jason Batalden. I'm the Assistant Director at Continuing Education Workforce Training, or as we like to refer to it as SWEET. And we're coming live from my, well, not live, this isn't going to be live, but we're recording this podcast from my dining room. And with us today, we have Father Hugh Feiss. And Father, say hello real quick so that the audience can see you if they're watching the video.
Howdy.
Very good. Father, you're coming to us from the Monastery of Ascension in Jerome, Idaho. It's a Benedictine monastery. And Father, there are probably we could have a great discussion just about the monastery and its history in Idaho. And as we've discovered, a lot of people aren't really aware there is a monastery in Idaho, but we have one, and it's been around since 1965. Very good. So Father, we have you on today. I'm going to have you introduce yourself. Oh, by the way, just in general, we are still doing our loyal listeners to our Sweet podcast. I know I've got at least 5 of them out there. Our loyal listeners, we're continuing to produce episodes. We're doing it in the way everything's being done today through Zoom. And so this is not an endorsement of Zoom. I'm not asking. It's not a promotion of Zoom, but that's the way we're doing it today. And we'll get this up and posted, and we'll continue to use this format. Typically, as always, we're still going to stick to our 20-minute rule. And as we do when we start the 20-minute timer, we do it when we hear the word welcome. So welcome, Father Hugh. I'm just going to ask if there's a reason why I have invited you to be on the show today, and it has to do with kind of your personal experience, or not experience, expertise. But Father, before we jump into the reason why we're having on, you got to introduce yourself at all a little bit to our audience, and tell us maybe where you're kind of from, and maybe just how long you've been a monk at the monastery, and maybe a little bit of insight too into your expertise, your field of study, I should say.
I am a native of Eastern Oregon, and I went to the Catholic Seminary in Mount Angel, Oregon, which was operated by a monastery. And so I did my high school and college there, and priesthood studies. And then I studied in Washington, D.C. for a number of years, philosophy and theology, and then in Rome. And my specialty in Rome was medieval theology. So that's what makes me an expert on the Black Death. Which I am not, but I guess I know more than a lot of people do about it.
Well, you know more than I do. And considering today's relevant issue of pandemics, I figure let's have a conversation maybe about, it's not the plague of the 14th and 15th, or 14th century at least, and the many times it appeared thereafter, was probably not the first virus to attack the human race in history, but it is kind of the most infamous. Is that the right? Would you call it the most infamous so far? Everybody has heard about the plague.
Yeah, it's also the worst by far. Yeah, and The first time the plague came was during the time of the Emperor Justinian in the century, and it did a lot of enormous amount of damage and killing people. But when it came in 1347 to 1351 to Europe, and it had been working its way there from somewhere around the Gobi Desert for several decades, apparently. There it killed in Europe maybe somewhere between 20 and 50% of all the people. Wow. So, I mean, that, in terms of today, if there's 300 million people in the United States, then that would be somewhere between 80 million and 150 million. So that was the magnitude of the Black Plague was quite a bit different than this one. But the plague there had a different kind of cause too. It was carried by fleas, and the fleas would then feed on rats, and the rats would carry the fleas around, and at some point the fleas would gorge too much and kind of blow up, and that would then launch the disease. And there were really 3 strains to it. 2 of them were almost always lethal, and the third, what we call the bubonic plague, was not quite as lethal as that. Wow. So anyway, you could catch this from this parasite, and you could also get it directly from people that were infected. So, but the difference between us and them is they didn't know what caused it, and they didn't know what to do about it. Yeah.
Well, and then I suppose, the medieval period isn't necessarily known as one of the cleanlier periods of human history either. So I imagine just a lot of things rampant, everything from waste disposal or lack thereof to everything else was a breeding ground probably for fleas and this wonderful little virus or epidemic that swept through. So hopefully there's a few differences other than just the mortality rate of the virus per se. But so that kind of just brings me a question though, a little bit. People didn't know. Obviously, there's all sorts of mythical ideology or mythical practices that are people point to everywhere from those long masks that you see in drawings depicted in art with the long nose that people would wear, with the idea that was supposed to. I guess I'm saying is the people approached the plague a lot differently than we could say we're approaching this period of pandemic. Is that safe to assume, or no? Do you see some similarities there?
They suspected that bad air had something to do with it, and so the people that could, the wealthy people, some of them would go out to their country estates to wait it out, which they were self-distancing, so that probably had some good results, or it could have, but by and large, and then of course they would pray, and that would have kind of it was counterproductive, we know, because they were getting together where they could share the causes of the disease, but that was one of their strategies, or 2 of them, I guess. Yeah, and then people reacted differently. I mean, you could do a lot of praying and hope, ask God to help you, or you could just say, "Yeah, there's nothing we can do. Fate is after us, so let's have a party and have a good time." And those were kind of extreme reactions. Other people thought the best thing to do was just to try to eat healthy and exercise and so forth. So there were different strategies, just like there are today.
And really, it's kind of just more on just trying to cope. I mean, I think that's one of the just interesting comments things that kind of struck me a little bit when I was doing just a little look at this was, I mean, it was a reality changer. Like, the plague in the 1300s, regardless of, whether they understood what causes, or it changed the way, they lived, and how they lived. Is that safe to assume? I mean, that was my understanding, but I mean, is there real evidence of that in the history or did they just continue to kind of go as normal and just kind of treat it as, well, if you get it, you get it, and if you don't, you don't, kind of thing?
Well, some people did, but again, if 20 to 50% of the people are dying, and that stretch of 4 years is over different places, so the mortality could happen in a few months. And so one thing they changed, they had to do a lot of mass burials for it was, and it was just a kind of a pervasive fear as far as we know. I mean, Boccaccio, who wrote the Decameron, it was about some people that escaped to the country and then told stories to each other. He has a description of the reaction of people. I mean, this is scary what we have now, but it was infinitely more scary then. I mean, because it wasn't happening in New York City or something. It was happening down the street. Your neighbors were dying like flies.
Yeah, it could be in the house next door to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Paul, you have a question?
Yeah, I thought I remembered reading that that at some point during the plague, they actually thought it was being transmitted by cats, and they went on basically a purge of killing felines, and that actually worsened it since the cats were no longer killing the rats. Is that true?
That I don't know. I never heard of that. Cats would have the fleas too, of course, I think. But yeah, that if they did that, that was a bad idea. Medieval people weren't very fond of cats. They liked them as rat killers, but that's about it.
They weren't seen as pets,
No.
Other than they were very functional, huh?
Pretty much. I think one goat was worth 9 cats. Good mousers all, of course. I read that somewhere anyway.
I like that. So kind of like dealing like currently, I guess you brought up an earlier comment too, that you said the rich people were able to kind of escape to their country estates. We almost kind of see that today too, a little bit, as that I'm assuming the plague, or is that a false assumption on my part, that the plague in the 14th century, did that affect the wealthy as the poor equally, or is my assumption correct that obviously the poor were a lot harder impact by the plague than the wealthy?
Fine statistics are kind of hard to come by, but
Yeah.
one of the reasons the plague was so devastating was that Europe had a number of really bad harvests from 1315 to 1325, which had killed a lot of people and weakened the population from malnutrition.
Oh.
And so you would expect that the wealthier people wouldn't have been malnourished like the poor people. So it may have helped them some, but by and large, it was not a respecter of persons once you got it. And it would only have been the more common version, the bubonic version, where maybe your resistance would have helped you, like today, where they say, if you have pre-existing conditions, it'd be harder on you.
Right.
I think that the people that got the plague, a lot higher percentage of them died than if you get this virus.
Yeah.
Whatever reason.
Yeah, I think the mortality rate is, and it wasn't right. It just is. It was a more vicious killer, maybe as a virus than even what we're dealing with here, maybe.
I think so.
Yeah. So, but it was kind of also a great equalizer, wasn't it? I mean, economies kind of changed after that a little bit too. Is that kind of the impact of that one?
Yeah, because most people were engaged in agriculture, and most of the agriculture was on manors, large farms where there were sharecroppers or different forms of labor by the individual workers in relation to the land. And with the Black Plague, the value of labor went way up.
Oh.
So the wages went way up, and so there were laws. Like in England, they had to pass laws to put the wealthy passed laws to put a limit on how much you could pay the laborers so that they couldn't bargain, and that ultimately led to the great revolt of 1381. Because you have to remember that they had this big plague around 1350, but it came several times every generation for another couple hundred years, and it nailed the people that weren't immune yet, and
right.
So took out a lot of younger people, and so labor, a whole bargaining power of labor shifted, and that was really the end of the manorial system. If you owned a farm and you couldn't find workers, the best thing to do was rent it out, and so that's what they did. A lot of rentals, and then if you were a poor farmer, you owned 3 acres and the 3 guys around you all died. If you could manage it, you would buy up theirs and your holdings would become bigger. So it had a lot of effects on the economy. I mean, it kept the population down for 100 years. It never recovered to what it was before the plague before the starvations in the early 14th century. It took 150 years to recover that.
Wow. Huh. So like, the kind of question I'm curious then is, I mean, and maybe it's too much of a stretch, maybe because the plague itself, it was 1300s, the science, the technology, the understanding of how it worked, sort of that, just that ignorance, maybe that is sort of a inhibitor, but is there lessons from that experience that, maybe we should be looking at in modern day to kind of say to ourselves, okay, I mean, viruses aren't new to humanity. And it could be argued that maybe as a world, as a generation or two, we got lulled into sleep after 1918 a little bit, thinking that maybe viruses aren't, we forgot how serious they can be. But is there a lesson maybe for us in modern day as we kind of are approaching this new COVID-19, sort of this pandemic, and as we're all trying to determine what the new reality is going to look like? Is there anything we can learn from the medieval experience, the experience of the 14th century?
Well, one thing is, we talk about globalization, and it's the big New Deal for the last, few decades, but it has its drawbacks, and one of them is that it spreads disease, and the Black Death got to England, got to Europe. It hit Sicily in 1347 on a boat, and coming from
right
across the Mediterranean, and so we have to think about that in terms of if this, in a tightly connected world like this, things are going to spread. And they had a boat once in a while landing, and we have thousands of airplanes every day, or we did, and so that's going to now it's a global issue in a way that it wasn't then, even though it was global then also. And I mean, so we're going to have to figure out about, there are different ways this could go. You could have closed tendency to close systems, country stuff, or you could have a growth and cooperation to deal with this on the international level. And then the other thing is, just as those peasants were able to become middle class if they could buy up enough land, and it did strengthen the nation's central government some as the rural aristocracy lost their workers and their incomes. Then the state became stronger, and that's likely to happen as a result of this. And we're giving all kinds of powers to the government that they don't ordinarily have, and it would be important probably to think about how we're going to get those back.
Yeah,
and because it helped poor people in some ways, the ones that survived, but it also made them much more under the thumb of the national government rather than the local lord. So that's something to think about, I think.
No, I think that's a valid point. I think that's an interesting just discussion in general, and even probably a bigger topic than even this podcast. But just that discussion. That's, to be honest, and probably that's the thing I've been constantly sort of just kind of running over my mind. The new reality. What's this new reality, right? Even in the way we work. I mean, here I am. I'm sitting in my dining room. You're in your place, and Paul is in his place, and yet we're still, doing the work. This was a thing that we did in the studio on the campus, and now we're having to figure out a way to do. That's a new reality, and whether it continues like this or not, obviously, is a question for a much larger discussion with probably a lot more important people than us. But that's the thing, the new reality, and so I'm assuming that even, but yes, the plague, I think I even read that the last sort of major spread of the plague occurred in the early 1900s in San Francisco. It was some rats, same issue rats, but they were organized. It didn't go really huge, but it was present. Oh my goodness. Well, that's the timer, Father. All right. Well, anyway, but they did a mass eradication of the rats, and they got rid of them all. And so, but still, the bubonic plague is still present, even in some places, even recently. So, but it's that new reality, right? We all have to learn to live sort of a new reality, and yet how do we maintain what's important to us and as individuals and as individuals in government, I suppose, is the real challenge that we're facing.
Yeah, that's kind of the last thing is, so we're doing without a whole bunch of stuff, and do we want to go back to the old normal? That's
right.
what Hope said, I think, the other day, and that's worth thinking about too.
Mm-hmm.
Like I got an email from this friend of mine, a young woman who has been working 2 full-time jobs and going to graduate school, so she hasn't had time to do anything but work, study, and sleep for a number of years. And now she's only working 1 job. And for the first time in living memory, I guess, since she was in high school, she has time to do hobbies and read about stuff she never has. And I wouldn't be surprised if she doesn't want to go back to the old way. At least she's actually enjoying herself more than I ever remember.
Right.
So.
Maybe that's the one silver lining in all this, is maybe it's given us, hopefully, not only as individuals, but maybe communities, maybe, countries, states, the whole 9 yards, an opportunity for us to kind of re-examine, is the way we were living, was it really worthwhile? So, that's a great point, Father. I'd like to dwell on that one for a little bit. So, Well, we ran out of our time, Father. Father Hugh, I kind of hope we get you back on the show sometime. Maybe we could talk about something a little less morbid than the pandemic of the 14th century.
That would be fine. I don't know if anything else, but we can find something maybe. Yeah.
Well, you got an interesting life over there. I hope that my dedicated 5 listeners, to this, decide to Google Monastery of Ascension today, and maybe when everything's all cleared up and you guys are safe, they can come out and see your lovely little place out there. It's one of my favorite places to visit. Paul, you got anything you want to add before we shut the show down?
No, maybe you can just give me a little explanation of the monastery just quickly, because we really didn't go into that at all. I just a brief explanation what the monastery is and what it does.
Well, the monastery is kind of small. It has about 10, 12 members, and they came here. The Catholic authorities of Idaho wanted a monastery, so they invited us from Oregon to come over, and they sent a couple guys over, and they prospected, and we were given this land outside of Jerome that we're on. You can see out the window there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's out there.
And so over the time they build it up, and what we do is we have a retreat house or a guest house, and we host a lot of different organizations. Currently, we host a lot of quilting groups. They love the place. So, and that's how we support ourselves, that and the income from the farm, which we don't run ourselves. And we're a very disparate group. I mean, I'm the scholar, and I was before I came here. I was a professor and all. So that's it's because it's small and we're not heavily engaged in some project. There's room for individual efforts. So we have a big library, so it's good for me. And we help different ways. We when we were younger, we did a lot of help in different churches when they needed a priest, and I was a university chaplain for 11 years and things like that. So we've tried to be a contributing member to the church and society around us. I don't know if that helps.
No, it does. It does.
We pray a lot. I mean, maybe 2 or 3 hours a day at different times we gather to pray, and that's our number one thing. We all do that.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you for explaining that to me.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, we're going to shut her down. We thank you, Father Hugh, for your time, and we thank you for your wisdom and insight on this. And hopefully this podcast will entertain and enlighten, and then maybe encourage further discussions. As always, those of you who are interested, hey, CEWT is still open and up for business. We're running classes. Our new catalog hits May 4th. So most likely this podcast will be out when the new catalog is up and running. So we want to be sure to have you check that out. So you want to go to cetrain.isu.edu and check out the catalog, download it, and take a look at it. Father Hugh, again, thank you very much. Paul, thank you very much. And we're just really glad to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you.